Are you deaf or just stupid? The judge snarled. I said, hand over the notebook. The sound that followed didn't belong in a courtroom. It belonged in an alley, in a bar fight, in a place where nobody was watching. A palm against a cheek, sharp and final, ricocheting off marble floors and 40-foot ceilings until it felt like the whole building had been struck. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman screamed and clutched her purse to her chest like it might protect her from what she'd just witnessed. Up on his throne of mahogany and self-importance, Judge Walter Krieg didn't even flinch. If anything, the corner of his mouth twitched upward, the way a man's mouth twitches when he's gotten exactly what he wanted. Cuff her, he said. Contempt. But the woman standing at the podium, blood blooming at the corner of her lip, did not crumble the way he expected. She lifted one finger and pressed it, almost gently, to the spot on her cheek that was already turning a furious shade of red. Then she looked at him, not with fear, not with fury, but with something far more dangerous. Certainty. You're going to want to sit down for what happens next, she said quietly, because in about 90 seconds, that chair isn't going to belong to you anymore. To understand how a courtroom in a mid-sized American county became a crime scene disguised as a place of justice, you have to understand the room itself. Courtroom 4B of the Meridian County Courthouse was not designed to make anyone feel safe. It was designed decades ago by architects who believed that intimidation and order were the same thing. 20-foot walls of dark walnut, a bench raised so high above the floor that anyone standing before it had to tilt their chin upward just to make eye contact with the man who held their fate in his hands. Fluorescent light that hummed just loud enough to fray your nerves if you sat under it for more than an hour. For 11 years, that room had belonged to one man and one man only, Judge Walter Krieg. If you asked the public defenders who worked his docket, they'd tell you about him in hushed voices, the way you'd describe a storm that had already flattened 3 towns and was rumored to be building strength again. Krieg was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that comes from a golf course rather than honest work outdoors. He wore his robe like a crown. He spoke to defendants the way some men speak to dogs that have already been beaten into obedience, not with anger, but with bored, weary contempt, as if their suffering was simply an inconvenience to his afternoon schedule. The complaints against him had been piling up for years in a filing cabinet nobody wanted to open. Excessive sentences for petty offenses committed by poor defendants, suspiciously generous rulings for landlords, corporations, and anyone who happened to golf at the same country club as Krieg himself. A pattern so consistent that eventually it stopped looking like bad luck and started looking like a business model. That's where Renata Okafor came in. Renata wasn't the kind of woman who announced her presence. She had learned a long time ago, first as a public defender clawing her way through law school on scholarships and double shifts, and later as a federal prosecutor who had taken down 2 separate organized crime rings, that the people who talk the loudest in a room are rarely the ones who actually run it. She preferred to watch, to listen, to let a room believe she was invisible right up until the moment it mattered. On the morning this story begins, Renata sat in the 3rd row of the gallery in courtroom 4B, wearing a plain grey cardigan and carrying nothing more threatening than a spiral notebook and a chewed-up pen. She looked to anyone glancing her way like a paralegal killing time between hearings, or maybe a nervous relative waiting for a loved one's case to be called. What nobody in that room knew, not the bailiffs, not the clerks, not Judge Krieg himself, was that 48 hours earlier, Renata Okafor had been sworn in as the newly appointed Director of Judicial Oversight for the entire circuit. She had the full backing of the state's highest court, an emergency mandate that gave her the authority to suspend a sitting judge on the spot if she personally witnessed serious misconduct, and a growing folder of anonymous complaints that all pointed to the same rotten source, this exact room. She hadn't come to arrest anyone, not yet. She'd come to watch, to document, and to decide whether the rumors about Walter Krieg were exaggerated gossip or the tip of something much larger. She would have her answer within the hour. Renata hadn't taken this assignment lightly. Complaints against sitting judges were common enough that most of them died quietly in a drawer somewhere, filed and forgotten by overworked clerks who had 100 other fires to put out. What made the file on Walter Krieg different wasn't the volume of complaints. Plenty of judges accumulated a handful of disgruntled letters over a career. It was the pattern underneath them. Every complaint, no matter who filed it, described the same courtroom behaving the same way toward the same kinds of people. Working-class defendants treated like inconveniences, landlords and corporate defendants treated like honored guests. It read less like a list of isolated bad days and more like a blueprint, and blueprints don't write themselves by accident. She had spent the drive to the courthouse that morning thinking about her own father, a man who had once stood in a courtroom much like this one, decades earlier, and walked out with a record that had followed him for the rest of his life over a charge that in hindsight never should have stuck. She hadn't become a lawyer because she loved the law in some abstract, textbook sense. She'd become a lawyer because she'd watched, as a child, exactly how easily the law could be twisted into a weapon against people who had no way to fight back. That memory was part of why she never let herself look away from a courtroom, no matter how uncomfortable it became to watch. The case being heard, when Renata took her seat, involved a 19-year-old named Deshaun Miller. He stood at the defense table in a shirt one size too big, borrowed from an older cousin for the occasion, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. His public defender, a woman named Priya Chandra, who looked like she hadn't slept properly in a decade, was trying to explain why her client had arrived 14 minutes late to a mandatory check-in. "Your Honor, the bus route was suspended for repairs that morning. My client called the probation office the moment he realized. I don't care about buses, counselor." Krieg's voice rolled out of the microphone with the smooth, practiced cruelty of a man who had said this exact sentence hundreds of times before. "I care about respect for this court's time. Mr. Miller apparently believes punctuality is optional when it's inconvenient. He works 2 jobs to support his mother. Your Honor, he's completed 11 months of a 12-month probation without a single violation until probation revoked. 30 days in county." Krieg didn't even look up from the paperwork in front of him as he said it. The way a man signs a receipt without reading the total. From 2 rows ahead of Renata, a woman, presumably the boy's mother, made a sound like something breaking inside her chest. Deshaun's shoulders folded inward. He didn't argue. He'd clearly learned, the hard way, that arguing with Walter Krieg only made things worse. Renata's pen moved fast across her notebook. She wasn't writing down her opinions. She was writing down facts, sharp and clinical, the time on the clock, the exact wording Krieg had used. The disproportion between the offense and the punishment, 14 minutes late, 30 days in a cell. She had seen enough sentencing patterns in her career to recognize when a judge was applying the law, and when a judge was simply exercising a grudge against a category of people he had decided, long ago, deserved less mercy than everyone else. She was so absorbed in her documentation that she didn't register the footsteps until a shadow fell across her page. What made the moment sting more than most was how ordinary it looked from the outside. Nobody in that gallery gasped when Krieg revoked Deshaun's probation. Nobody stood up. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the way people do when they witness something wrong, but have long since convinced themselves that saying anything would only make their own situation worse. That, Renata thought, was the real engine behind a courtroom like this one. It didn't need everyone in the room to agree with the cruelty. It only needed enough people to stay quiet. She'd seen the same dynamic play out in city council chambers, in HOA meetings, in boardrooms anywhere a person with unchecked authority learned that silence from bystanders was as good as approval. Walter Krieg hadn't built this system alone. He'd built it with the help of every attorney who'd decided a losing battle wasn't worth their career, every clerk who'd learned to look the other way, every deputy who'd decided obedience was safer than conscience. The rot wasn't just in one man, it was in the culture that had grown comfortable around him. Deputy Russell Tate had built his entire identity around one function, making people afraid of him. He was built like a refrigerator, someone had dressed in a tactical vest. And he wore his authority the way some men wear cologne, thick, unmistakable, applied with the assumption that everyone around him would simply have to deal with it. "No note-taking in the gallery," he said, his voice pitched low enough to feel like a threat rather than a rule. "Hand over the notebook." Renata glanced up, unhurried. "This is a public proceeding, Deputy. I'm well within my rights to observe and take handwritten notes. I'm not recording audio or video." Tate's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected a response. Certainly not one delivered so calmly, and definitely not from a woman he'd already decided, based on nothing but a glance, didn't belong in a room like this. "I said hand it over." Their voices had risen just enough to catch the bench's attention. Krieg's gavel tapped once, an irritated little sound. "Deputy, is there a problem in my gallery?" Spectators refusing a lawful order. "Your Honor," won't surrender her notes. Krieg's eyes drifted toward Renata with the mild curiosity of a man inspecting an insect he was considering stepping on. "Bring her up. Let's see what's so fascinating." Renata closed her notebook with a quiet, deliberate click. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, though she hadn't expected it to arrive quite this fast. Every instinct told her to stay seated, to let the confrontation dissolve on its own. But there was a version of this story where she simply left, and there was a version where she found out exactly how far these two men were willing to go when they thought no one with real power was watching. She chose to find out. There's a particular kind of quiet that falls over a room in the seconds before something irreversible happens. It's not silence exactly, the fluorescent lights still hummed. Someone in the back coughed. A chair creaked as its occupant shifted forward to get a better view. But underneath all of it was a stillness that Renata had learned to recognize over years of courtrooms and depositions and interrogation rooms. It was the sound of a room realizing, on some instinctive level, that the next 30 seconds were going to matter more than the previous 30 minutes combined. She felt it settle over courtroom 4B like a held breath, and she let it. Sometimes the most useful thing a person can do in a moment like that is simply stay calm enough for everyone else's fear to have nowhere to attach itself. Deputy Tate reached for her arm the way a man reaches for something he expects to be easy. Renata rotated her shoulder a half-inch, just enough that his fingers closed on nothing but air, and rose to her feet under her own power. "Don't put your hands on me again," she said. Not loud, not shaking, just absolutely, unmistakably final. Something about her tone unsettled him more than any struggle could have. He compensated the way insecure men in uniform often do, by getting louder. "Walk." Now. She walked down the aisle, past rows of stunned faces, her heels striking the floor in a rhythm that sounded almost ceremonial. She stopped at the podium and looked up at Krieg, who peered down at her over the rim of his glasses like she was a stain he hadn't noticed on his carpet before. "Name," he demanded. "My name is irrelevant to the fact that your deputy just attempted to seize private property with no warrant, no probable cause, and no legal basis, Your Honor." A silence fell over the room so complete you could hear the ancient HVAC system rattling somewhere above the ceiling tiles. Nobody spoke to Walter Krieg that way. Nobody in this courthouse had spoken to him that way in over a decade. His face darkened, the practiced boredom curdling into something uglier. "You barge into my courtroom, disrupt my docket, and now you presume to educate me on the law." "I'm not educating you," Renata said. "I'm informing you of a fact you seem to have forgotten. The public has a constitutionally protected right to observe and document open proceedings." Contempt. Krieg snapped, slamming his palm against the bench. "Deputy, take the notebook. Take her into custody. Let her spend the weekend somewhere quieter and reconsider her manners." Tate lunged for the notebook, but Renata pulled it against her chest and pivoted, her movement smooth enough that his bulk carried him half a step past her, boots squealing against the floor. Humiliated in front of the man he answered to and in front of a gallery full of witnesses, Tate abandoned whatever remained of his professional restraint. He didn't reach for the notebook again. He reached for her. The slap landed across her left cheek with a crack that seemed to swallow the room whole. Her head snapped sideways. White heat bloomed across her face. Her heel caught the carpet's edge, and she staggered, but she did not go down, and she did not release the notebook. The gallery detonated into chaos. Someone screamed. Attorneys who had spent years averting their eyes from this exact kind of behavior suddenly found themselves on their feet. The court reporter's hands froze above her keys. "Order!" Krieg bellowed, not at his deputy, not in horror at what had just happened in his own courtroom, but at the gallery, as though their reaction to violence was the actual crime being committed. "Cuff her, deputy. Now!" Tate reached for his handcuffs, a flicker of triumph returning to his face. Renata straightened slowly. A thin thread of blood traced down from the corner of her mouth where her own teeth had caught her lip. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't cry out. She simply turned her head and looked him directly in the eyes, and something in that look made a 230-pound man freeze mid-motion, the cuffs dangling forgotten from his fingers. "You," she said quietly, "just made the worst decision of your entire career." Krieg scoffed, though something behind his eyes had already begun to flicker with doubt. "Cuff her," he repeated, but the thunder had drained out of his voice. Tate stepped forward again. "Stop," Renata said, one word, delivered with a weight that stopped him cold. She reached into the inner pocket of her cardigan. Tate's hand shot to his holster on reflex. "Keep your hands visible," he barked, his voice cracking under the strain of a situation spiraling far outside his control. She ignored him entirely. From her pocket she withdrew a slim navy folder, opened it with 2 fingers, and set it down on the podium with a sound that landed like a verdict. The gold state seal caught the fluorescent light. Beneath it, a laminated credential with her photograph and a title that made the blood drain from Walter Krieg's face in real time. "My name," she said, loud enough now for every corner of the room to hear, "is Renata Okafor. As of 2 days ago, I serve as Director of Judicial Oversight for this entire circuit, appointed under emergency authority by the state's Chief Justice. And as of this exact moment, Judge Krieg, you are relieved of your duties, pending a full misconduct investigation." Krieg's mouth opened. No sound emerged. He looked for the first time in 11 years inside this room, like a man watching the floor disappear beneath his own feet. "This is a stunt," he finally managed, his voice climbing an octave he clearly wasn't used to using. "I'm an elected official. You can't just walk in here, and I can," Renata said, cutting him off with surgical precision. "And I have." She reached into her notebook and produced a folded document, the emergency order she'd been carrying since the moment she'd walked into this building, signed by the highest judicial authority in the state. She held it up so the room could see it. "This grants me full unilateral authority to suspend any sitting judge in this district in the event of egregious misconduct witnessed firsthand. I came here today expecting to find bias. I did not expect to watch a sitting judge order the physical assault of a courtroom observer." She lifted her thumb, still stained red from her own lip, and held it up for the room to see. "You are done here, Mr. Krieg. Today. This is outrageous," Krieg roared, slamming both hands against his desk. He turned to the 2 remaining deputies stationed near the exit doors. "Arrest this woman. I am ordering you to arrest her immediately." Neither man moved. They had both clocked the gold seal on that folder, and unlike their disgraced colleague, they understood exactly what it meant to defy it. Renata turned her attention to Tate, who had gone pale and rigid, the swagger completely evaporated from his posture. "Deputy Tate, you are stripped of all courtroom authority, effective immediately. Weapon, badge, radio on the defense table." "Now, I was just following orders," he stammered, his voice small in a way it had never been before. "Following an unlawful order to commit assault is not a defense, Deputy. It's a confession." Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Table, now." Trembling, Tate unclipped his radio, unpinned his badge and drew his weapon with 2 fingers, laying each item on the table like a man surrendering pieces of himself he could never get back. Renata turned back to the bench. "Step down, Mr. Krieg." Krieg gripped the edges of his desk so hard his knuckles whitened. "I built this courthouse. I have friends on the appellate bench. I know the mayor personally. You think you can just erase 11 years with a piece of paper?" "Call your friends from your attorney's office," Renata replied evenly. "Right now, you're going to walk out of that chair under your own power, or I will have you removed in restraints in front of everyone in this gallery. Your choice." For a long, suffocating moment, nobody moved. Then something in Krieg seemed to collapse inward. The bluster drained out of him all at once, leaving behind an old man who suddenly looked every one of his 63 years. He rose slowly, unzipped his robe with shaking hands, and let it fall over the back of his chair, a small, symbolic surrender that felt louder than anything he'd said all morning. He walked down the side steps without meeting anyone's eyes and disappeared through the heavy doors at the back of the room. Renata watched him go. Then she picked up her notebook, her credentials and her pen, and walked toward the bench herself. The distance felt longer than it should have, past the defense table, past a broken deputy still standing frozen beside his surrendered weapon, up a short flight of wooden steps that had, until 60 seconds ago, belonged exclusively to a tyrant. She didn't put on the discarded robe. She didn't need the costume of authority. She sat down in the heavy leather chair, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at a gallery full of faces that had never once seen this room look anything other than terrifying. "Madam Court Reporter," she said, "please strike the last 30 minutes from the official record, noting a procedural reset under emergency judicial authority." "Yes, yes, Your Honor." The reporter stammered, fingers already flying across her keys. Renata's gaze settled on the young man still standing near the defense table, tears streaking silently down his face. "Mr. Miller, please step forward." Deshawn approached on unsteady legs, his public defender close beside him. "I've reviewed your file," Renata said, her voice softening into something warmer, but no less firm. 11 months of clean probation. 2 jobs. A mother depending on you. A bus that broke down through no fault of your own. She picked up her pen. A courtroom exists to deliver justice, not punishment disguised as discipline. The violation is dismissed. Given your record, I'm terminating your probation early, effective today. You're free to go. The sob that rose from the gallery was unmistakable. His mother, collapsing into the arms of a stranger beside her, weeping with a relief that had nothing rehearsed about it. Deshawn looked up at Renata like she'd descended from somewhere far above this room. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Go home," she said gently. "Take care of your mother." As mother and son embraced in the aisle, Renata turned back to the deputies still standing near the doors. "Take Deputy Tate into custody. Process him for assault under color of authority and obstruction. Holding cells, not the administrative wing." Tate didn't resist as his former colleagues clicked cuffs onto his own wrists. The same steel he'd used to threaten dozens of defendants over the years now closing around him instead. Renata lifted the gavel. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," she announced. "When we return, we'll resume today's docket, and let the record show that whatever fear ran this courthouse before today, it ends now." The gavel came down once, sharp and final. Taking the bench that afternoon had felt, in some ways, like the easy part. The real work began after the courtroom emptied, when Renata walked into Krieg's private chambers for the first time, a room thick with cigar smoke, lined with law books that looked untouched, and covered in framed photographs of Krieg shaking hands with men who clearly mattered more to him than the people he sentenced. She didn't sit in his oversized leather chair. She pulled a plain wooden one to the side desk, opened her laptop, and began the audit that would define the next 72 hours of her life. As the newly appointed oversight director, she had immediate access to the district's sentencing archives, financial disclosures, and case histories going back a decade. She had learned long ago that men who abused power publicly were almost always concealing something worse behind closed doors, and Walter Krieg was no exception. It took 3 sleepless nights, fueled by black coffee and sheer will, but the pattern eventually surfaced, and once it did, it unraveled his entire career like a pulled thread on a cheap sweater. Cross-referencing his eviction rulings against corporate filings, Renata found something too consistent to be coincidence. Whenever a tenant faced eviction from a property owned by a shell company called Ashford Realty Group, Krieg ruled in favor of the landlord in 98% of cases, often refusing tenants any real opportunity to present a defense before ordering immediate removal and steep financial penalties. A forensic accountant flown in from the state capital cracked the corporate structure within half a day. Ashford Realty Group was a subsidiary of a much larger development trust, and sitting on that trust's board, collecting substantial consulting fees funneled through a maze of shell companies, was none other than Walter Krieg's own brother-in-law. For years, Krieg had been quietly clearing poor and predominantly minority tenants out of aging buildings to make room for luxury developments, while his family profited from every eviction he personally rubber-stamped. Renata didn't stop there. She pulled Deputy Tate's internal disciplinary file, a document that had somehow avoided being properly logged for years. 17 separate excessive force complaints filed against him over 5 years by defendants and inmates. 14 of those complaints had been dismissed without any investigation, each one personally signed off by Judge Walter Krieg. They hadn't just worked together, they'd protected each other, Krieg providing the legal cover, Tate providing the muscle. An entire ecosystem of intimidation, built to keep the district's most vulnerable residents too afraid to push back. The deeper Renata dug, the more the courthouse itself began to resemble a machine built for a single purpose, extracting value from people who had the least power to resist. She found fee schedules quietly inflated for defendants who couldn't afford private counsel. She found probation terms stacked with technical requirements almost impossible for someone working 2 jobs to satisfy, the kind of requirements that guaranteed a certain percentage of violations no matter how hard a person tried to comply. Each individual rule looked defensible on paper. Stacked together, they formed a trap disguised as due process. She thought about how easy it would have been for any single person along the chain to interrupt this, a clerk who flagged the sentencing disparities, an attorney who filed a formal complaint instead of grumbling in the hallway, a colleague on the bench who asked an uncomfortable question at the right moment. Nobody had. It had taken an outsider with real authority and nothing to lose within this particular courthouse's social hierarchy to finally pull the thread that unraveled all of it. "Not anymore," Renata murmured to the empty office, the bruise on her cheek now deepening into a dark, angry purple. She made no attempt to hide it with makeup. She wore it quite deliberately, like evidence because that's exactly what it was. She compiled everything into a single exhaustive dossier: bank transfers, forged administrative waivers, sentencing transcripts, property records. This wasn't simply grounds for a judicial dismissal anymore. This was the foundation of a federal racketeering case. She called a former colleague at the U.S. Attorney's Office that same evening. When she laid out what she'd found, the silence on the other end of the line lasted several long seconds before the prosecutor finally spoke. "Renata," he said, "this isn't judicial misconduct. This is an organized criminal enterprise that happened to operate out of a courthouse." "Then treat it like one," she replied. "And I want a grand jury looking at Tate by the end of the week." 3 weeks after the slap that had, within hours, become the subject of hushed conversation across the entire county, the State Judicial Disciplinary Board convened behind closed doors in the Capitol. Walter Krieg sat at the defense table, and the transformation was almost impossible to reconcile with the man who had once ruled Courtroom 4B like a personal fiefdom. His tan had faded to something sickly and grey. His expensive suit hung loosely off a frame that seemed to have shrunk over the past 3 weeks. 2 defense attorneys flanked him, both visibly uneasy, the way lawyers get when they already know how a case is going to end. Across from him sat Renata, back in her judicial robes, posture immaculate, the bruise on her face now faded to a faint shadow that had become, in its own strange way, a permanent reminder of exactly what this fight had cost, and what it had ultimately proven. The board's chairman, a stern state Supreme Court justice, surveyed the towering stack of evidence binders in front of him. "Mr. Krieg, we've reviewed the financial ties connecting you to Ashford Realty Group. We've reviewed the buried disciplinary file on Deputy Tate, and we've all watched the footage of you ordering an armed officer to strike a courtroom observer in open session." "There's context missing," Krieg said, his voice thin. "I was under considerable stress. I didn't know who she was. And if she'd been an ordinary citizen with no title at all," the chairman said coldly, "would that have made the assault acceptable?" Krieg's attorney placed a hand on his arm before he could dig himself any deeper. "The board's decision is unanimous," the chairman said, closing the folder in front of him. "Effective immediately, you are permanently disbarred from the practice of law in this state, and your judicial pension is revoked in full." "My pension?" Krieg's voice cracked. "I served 30 years. "You served yourself," Renata said quietly, though every word carried across the room. "For 30 years you dressed cruelty up as discipline and profited from it. Losing a pension is the smallest consequence you're going to face today." As the chairman struck his gavel to close the hearing, the double doors at the back of the room opened and 2 federal agents walked in, expressions grim and unhurried. "Walter Krieg," the lead agent said, unclipping a set of handcuffs. "You're under arrest for racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Hands behind your back." Krieg broke down completely, sobbing as the cuffs closed around his wrists, casting one last desperate look toward Renata as they led him toward the exit. She didn't gloat. She didn't even blink. She simply watched with quiet satisfaction as the exact system he had spent a decade manipulating finally turned against him. Later that same afternoon, she received a call confirming that Deputy Tate had accepted a plea deal, 8 years in a federal penitentiary for assault under color of authority and conspiracy, the very kind of sentence he'd once handed down, casually, to people who'd never had the chance to fight back. The reckoning had taken 3 weeks. The corruption had taken over a decade to build, but it collapsed in the end, the way most houses built on rot eventually do, all at once, and completely. News of the disciplinary hearing didn't stay contained to legal circles for long. A local reporter who'd been covering courthouse corruption stories for years, mostly to an audience of a few hundred subscribers, ran a piece on the case that got picked up by a regional outlet, then a national one. Within days, clips of the disciplinary hearing's public portions were circulating widely, and comment sections filled with people sharing their own stories of judges, landlords, and officers who had never faced any real consequences for decisions that had upended their lives. Renata received messages from strangers she'd never meet, a woman in another state who said she'd finally worked up the courage to file a complaint against a judge who'd handled her custody case unfairly for years. A young man who said watching Deshawn's case dismissed on camera was the first time he'd ever seen someone who looked like him win against a system that usually only seemed to grind people down. She didn't respond to most of them individually. She didn't need to. The point had never been about her. Ashford Realty Group, once its ties to Krieg became public record, found itself the subject of a separate civil investigation launched by the State Attorney General's office, examining whether its eviction practices in other counties followed the same troubling pattern. Several tenants who had lost their homes years earlier filed a class action suit, arguing that they'd been denied a fair hearing under a judge who had a direct financial incentive to rule against them. It would take years for those cases to resolve, but for the first time, the people affected had documentation, momentum, and a legal precedent instead of just a grievance nobody would listen to. The next morning, Renata walked back into courtroom 4B for the first time since taking the bench. The air felt different immediately, lighter, somehow as though the building itself had been holding its breath for 11 years and had only just remembered how to exhale. The gallery was full, but the tension that usually hung over the room had been replaced by something closer to cautious hope. She climbed the same short flight of steps, sat down in the same heavy chair, smoothed the front of her robe, and picked up the gavel. "Court is now in session," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Let's begin. If this story left you with chills, you're not alone. It's proof that arrogance and corruption never stay hidden forever, no matter how many decades they've had to burrow in. Karma doesn't always arrive quickly, but when it finally lands, it lands with the full weight of everything it's been carrying." Renata Okafor didn't take that seat to punish anyone out of spite. She took it because real authority was never supposed to come from a raised hand or a raised voice. It comes from a steady mind and the refusal to look away from injustice, even when looking away would have been so much easier. She didn't just replace a corrupt judge that day. She gave that courtroom its soul back. In the weeks that followed, word of what happened in courtroom 4B spread well beyond the county line. Other public defenders in neighboring districts began quietly requesting reviews of their own judges' sentencing patterns. A handful of tenants who had lost eviction battles under suspicious circumstances reached out to legal aid organizations, wondering for the first time if their cases deserved a second look. None of it happened overnight, and none of it made front-page headlines outside the local paper. But something had shifted. The way a single crack in a dam doesn't flood a valley immediately, it just makes the eventual flood inevitable. Deshaun Miller finished out his probation-free year and eventually enrolled in community college on a small scholarship his public defender helped him find, determined to become a paralegal himself one day. Priya Chandra, the exhausted public defender who had fought so hard for him that morning, later said in an interview that it was the first time in 6 years on the job she'd watched a sentencing hearing end the way it was actually supposed to, with justice rather than punishment for its own sake. Renata never framed what happened in courtroom 4B as a personal victory. She'd spent her entire career watching systems fail the people who needed them most, and she knew better than anyone that one disbarred judge and one disgraced deputy didn't fix decades of accumulated harm. But it proved something worth proving, that even the most entrenched abuse of power has a breaking point, and sometimes all it takes to find it is one person willing to sit quietly in the third row, notebook in hand, refusing to look away. Do you think Judge Krieg got exactly what he deserved, or should the consequences have gone even further? Let us know in the comments below. And if stories about instant karma, quiet justice, and the moment power finally meets accountability keep you coming back, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the system can still work, and subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one.